And now Mike Vrancik is going to take over for our next panel on performance accountability. And we have another great panel of experts on proficiencies and efficiencies.
Thanks, Rich. I think while we're waiting for everybody to come up here, it's interesting the kind of a synergy a day like this takes on. And I think in the context of some of the things I think I've learned today, in hindsight, I might have thrown in effectiveness somewhere in the title of this forum. And I think that what we heard in the last speaker is a great segue to this panel, because we're going to talk now about not how we spend money efficiently, but how we measure, is it working or not? How effective is what we're doing for the educational environment? Our panel includes Marc Holzer, the Dean of Public Affairs and Administration at Rutgers, Margaret Goertz, co-director of the Consortium for Policy Research and Education, and a professor at the Graduate School of Education at the University of Pennsylvania, and Vincent Giordano, the executive director of the New Jersey Education Association. I think Margaret is going to go first. I think that's what we said. Okay.
Yeah, get it up for yeah. You want to move up I think this is yours, right?
WW, yeah. Okay, that's great. Just leave that.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a PowerPoint.
Does that work? Okay.
Listed on the bottom.
Thank you. I'm of the generation where I am in transition from the blackboard to the PowerPoint via overhead transparencies. Sorry. So what I'm going to be talking about this afternoon is laying out a framework for thinking about, talking about, and studying accountability. Let me start with a very simple definition of accountability. Accountability is providing an account of one's actions to another. And it's based on something called the principal-agent theory, where principals are those who establish an expectation regarding what is to be accomplished and to whom an account is owed. And agents are those of whom the performance is expected. So for those of you who are parents or in some way engage with children, think of the example of a parent establishing a schedule of chores for a child. So in this situation, the parent is the principal, the child is the agent, and we can think about ways of measuring performance, we can think about consequences. So in educational accountability, parents, citizens, and policymakers are calling on schools to account for their activities. And this can be done through many ways. I'm going to touch on some, and I know that Marc is going to touch on some others. It can be done through public reporting. We have the New Jersey school report cards, for example. It can be done through school board elections. We talked about that earlier today. It can be done through parental choice, parents determining where their child is going to attend school. It can be done through rewards and sanctions. And these are not discrete ways of holding the system accountable. So as I show from the chart up here, accountability in education has 5 dimensions. The first one is who is held accountable, and that's in the principal-agent theory, the agent, to whom, that is the principal, for what, how, and with what consequences. And how one defines each dimension determines the nature and type of the accountability system. So what I want to do is walk through the framework. I'm going to go down the columns, giving examples as I go along, and then I want to end with just a few issues in educational accountability. So let's start with the student. So students are generally held accountable to teachers and to parents. They're held accountable through their attendance in school, their behavior in school, and their performance measured in a number of different ways. If we talk about consequences, there are really very few formal consequences for students in accountability systems. One of those is what promotion gates, and this is something that's used in some school districts, New York, for example, in a few states, where students have to pass a certain exam before they can be promoted to the next grade. What's much more common are high school graduation requirements. Almost all states establish coursework requirements for students to graduate from high school, and about half of the states in the country require students to pass a high school graduation exam of some sort. And this is a very current issue in New Jersey, as there are proposals for increasing the high school graduation requirements in New Jersey, both in terms of the number and the rigor of courses being taken, and the proposal for creating more rigorous end-of-course examinations. And actually, the first phase of these requirements, all students who entered 9th grade this academic year must take Algebra 1, laboratory biology, and 4 years of college preparatory English, have been mandated by the state, interestingly, under the regulations for the new Funding Act through SFRA, rather than through the state board. The other phases requiring students to take geometry, Algebra 2, a lab-based chemistry course, and then the possibility of end-of-course exams in some of these content areas are now being discussed by the State Board of Education. And when we talk about how, high school graduation requirements are an example of what we call bureaucratic or legal accountability. And this is a system where there's a high level of control by the principal over the agent. And bureaucratic legal accountability is characterized by standard operating procedures, by compliance with organizational rules, and generally with some sort of reward, or sanction. And the distinction between bureaucratic and legal is really where the source of accountability comes from. Generally, we talk about bureaucratic accountability is coming from within an organization. We talk about legal accountability as something that is external to the organization. We talk a lot now about external accountability. No Child Left Behind, for example, being an example of legal accountability. So let's now look at teacher. Teachers are held accountable to a number of different groups, to each other as colleagues within a school setting, to parents, and particularly if anyone has taught in a suburban school or been a parent in a suburban school, there is a high level of parental accountability for teachers. They're held accountable to the school for their performance, and then sometimes to the district and to the state. What are they held accountable for? Well, there are some input accountabilities. For example, teachers must be certified. They must be fulfill certain requirements for recertification and licensure under the highly qualified teacher component of No Child Left Behind. There are other regulations. But by and large, teacher accountability is usually limited to internal evaluation of teaching. And the consequences are generally applied in terms of retention and tenure. And I'll use this as an example of what's called professional accountability, which really devolves authority to the agents, to the teachers themselves. This provides deference to expertise of the teachers. It's deference to those who deliver services to their clients. It assumes the need to tailor activities to the needs of the clients, in this case, teachers needing to tailor their teaching to the needs of their students, and specialized knowledge to do so. And these agents, or in this case teachers, operate within professional standards rather than external rules and regulations. And this has come to be known or categorized as internal accountability. And compliance is more through self-policing than it is through external review. And many people talk about the medical profession, for example, doctors as an example of professional accountability. However, there is a movement to tie increases in pay to teacher performance, particularly to the quote-unquote value added that teachers provide to students in their classes, and to the possible awarding of tenure. And this has been an issue raised both in New York City and late in New York State. And so when you start talking about tying these consequences to teacher performance, and you're really moving from professional back into bureaucratic accountability. The third, I'll sort of put together the third and the fourth columns together, school and district. Most attention when we talk, I think when we think about accountability now, particularly among those in the education field, we think about school and school district accountability, and we think about no child left behind. But what's interesting about school and district accountability is here is where one is most likely to see accountability for inputs, for processes, as well as for outcomes. Excuse me. So let me give some examples of accountability for inputs. This has been the traditional nature of school district accountability. And if we think about accreditation, for example, when schools and school districts used to go through the accreditation process, teams would come in and they would be concerned about the number of books in the library, about the facilities, and the kinds of inputs that are thought to have a positive effect on student learning. Processes is an area where we tend to get into instruction, programs for students, school culture and climate, the proper expenditure of money, for example. And New Jersey has actually incorporated processes as well as inputs into its accountability system, probably dating back to Chapter 212, a historical reference we made earlier today, the law in 1975, which required the Department of Education to set up to define thorough and efficient education, which it did through a set of inputs and processes. More recently, it's been embodied in what has been referred to as QSAC. For those of you not familiar with the acronym, it's the Quality Single Accountability Continuum. It's a system that has been designed in New Jersey to consolidate the monitoring requirements of multiple state and federal programs that have accrued over the years, and to identify if and when the state needs to provide assistance to or intervene in the operation of school districts. Again, this is not new. For those of you who have been in the education arena in New Jersey for a number of years, think back to level 1, 2, and 3 monitoring and to the predecessor to that. QSAC evaluates school districts in 5 areas using standards incorporated in a district performance review instrument. And these 5 areas are instruction and program, where there are 36 indicators, personnel, 16 indicators, fiscal management, 23 indicators, operations management, 26 indicators, and governance, which is interesting, governance, 51 indicators. And while the intent of QSAC is to assess a school district's capacity and effectiveness in providing a thorough and efficient education, and here I'm going to draw on Professor Trachtenberg's work on looking at QSAC, most of the indicators focus on compliance with legal and regulatory requirements. So it's very much bureaucratic accountability. So, like previous monitoring systems, it doesn't measure the level or quality of human, instructional, fiscal, and physical resources. It really does focus on compliance with what fiscal accounting, for example. And the system places very limited emphasis on outcomes, the actual performance of schools and districts. So while QSAC has districts show whether they've aligned their curriculum with all of their core curriculum content standards, the measures, as pointed out earlier today, the measures of student achievement are limited to language arts, mathematics, and science. And only 4 of the 64 points in the overall rubric cover the assessment of student performance on the other core content areas. And actually, there was a discussion a little bit earlier about NJ SMART and the student database. I think Gordon was talking about the importance of that. One question is that going to be expanded to include whether and how districts are measuring performance in the 6 core content areas that aren't covered by statewide assessments? But there is outcome accountability for schools and districts, and this is emphasized much more in No Child Left Behind, that focuses on student performance in language arts and mathematics. And both the CUSAC and the NCLB carry a set of sanctions with them for schools and districts. I want to touch on 2 other kinds of accountability, and that is market accountability and political accountability. Market accountability comes into play when you have parental choice. I'm going to use it in New Jersey in the context of charter schools. And here parents hold schools accountable for what they desire in education in terms of both cognitive and non-cognitive outcomes for their children. And there the consequences are withdrawing their children from the school. And the theory is the schools will alter their operations to satisfy parents' preferences for process and quality. However, charter schools are public schools, and they also are held to the same outcome measures as traditional public schools in terms of meeting the same performance standards for NCLB. And school districts are subject to political accountability through voters voting in school board members and, again, as we were discussing earlier, passage or defeat of the school budget. So let me end with just a few comments on issues in educational accountability. So there's a whole set of decisions that have to be made about who's going to be held accountable for whom, how, and with what consequences. How do you measure that? There are issues of fairness. When one is focused on student outcomes, how do you address differences in socioeconomic status, the kinds of out-of-school factors that Dr. Price was talking about? And this has led to a push to hold schools accountable for growth in student performance as well as their level of performance. And there's also been a call for multiple measures of student performance. But as we make the system more complex, we run into another issue, which is one of transparency. You know, if you're a parent, you want fairly simple, forthright information on how your school is doing. But as we develop these multiple indicators, the report card gets larger and longer. And if you're trying to incorporate that into one grade, as they do in Florida or they do in New York City, it gets to be even more complex. An accountability system has to focus attention on the information that's relevant to teaching and learning. This is really what it's all about. And so it gets to the issue of, again, what kinds of data you're collecting and who you're holding accountable for what. It has to develop the knowledge and skills of educators to interpret and act on that data. And then finally, I want to cycle back to Paul Trachtenberg's opening presentation with a focus on systems. One really needs to think about how to design a system of accountability that includes multiple and aligned input, process, and outcome measures with clearly defined responsibilities for assistance at all levels of the system. Thank you. Is that right?
Well, following that presentation, the reference to Paul Trachtenberg's work, let me argue for a few things here. One is that the E in thorough and efficient is really effectiveness. that what we need to be driven by is effectiveness, the end product, whether we're really producing students with the skills and competencies that they need to function in society. Secondly, that we really need a systematic approach to improving public education. We need a roadmap, and I'll walk you through one such roadmap that I pick up from the public sector. The third is that the third point I want to make is that the school community is insular. That you've all been talking to yourselves. I'm not really in that school community so much. So I used to be president of a school board, years ago and all. But I'm not there every day. I mean, the people in the schools talk to each other, but they're not talking to people outside the schools in that environment. And there's a lot of value there if they would just do that. So what I have up on the screen here is a comprehensive public sector productivity or performance, if you will, improvement scheme or schematic. And this applies to any public organizations, and we know that at least half the budgets at the local level are associated with the schools. The schools are a major part of the public sector. So if you begin on the left side, about 2/3 down, we're pouring an awful lot of resources into the schools. It's just money, it's labor, it's energy, it's the time of the kids who come to school, it's the parents who are involved in the schools, and what are we getting out of that? What are we supposed to be producing? Then if you move directly across to the right side, well, we produce internal capacities before we open the door in the morning or for the school year. Those are we're supposed to have everything in place, and we're very often weak on that. We produce outputs or services or, graduates, time in the classroom, whatever, but that doesn't get to what we've really promised the public, which are outcomes. What impact do we have on students' abilities to go out there and function in our society and deliver value or add value to our society? Well, that's where accountability really comes in. And one of our problems is that we have a very soft view of accountability. If you look at the arrows that go down, the one a little bit to the left is subjective, personal. That's the way we generally assess the public schools. We have an impression of whether the schools are working or not. And how is that measured? Well, it's measured generally by what communities you want to live in. Some communities have a, quote, reputation for being very effective in terms of public education, and people are willing to pay more if they have the money to move to those communities. And they're willing to pay more in taxes once they're there. But that's a pretty soft, fuzzy measure of whether the schools are really adding value. What we really need to do is move to that other count, which is objective or empirical. We need to know for certain what's happening in these districts and what we're really accomplishing. Then we can report back to the people who are making decisions, many of whom are, been on the panels or in this room, today. And that is, legislators or chief executives, corporate media are influencing decision-making. Citizens are making judgments. Parents as citizens are making judgments on the schools all the time. And we want to get away from the soft side and move to something that's much more objective, that's a fairer picture of what's happening in the schools. Because ultimately, if you look around on the bottom to the left, there's feedback from those people, and they are making budget decisions, or they're making tax-based decisions. They're making important decisions as to what happens with the schools. It might be a legislative decision or a judicial decision, or it might be voters, expressing their opinion in terms of taxes, or it might be the media, whatever. There's a lot of feedback, and that then cycles back to the resources issue, is whether we have enough resources to do the job that we promised to do. once we have the resources, or no matter what resources we have, how do we use them for the benefit of the students, for the benefit of the community, to make sure that we're delivering as promised? Well, I think there are 5 ways of looking at, or 5 components in this particular roadmap, and this is only one of many. One is managing for quality, and that begins with the top management support. Now, we often, frankly, fail to have that. Mayor Daley in Chicago just appointed a new school administrator, chief executive of the schools, but not anybody from the school community. I mean, his comment, I think it was in the paper this morning, was, well, the schools have failed under educational leadership for a long time. He appointed somebody who I think was running transit, who maybe used to be his chief of staff, who was a policeman for 6 years, whatever, somebody he trusted. Now, Bloomberg has pretty much done the same thing with Joel Klein. Joel didn't come out of the schools. Put him in, and we can argue whether Joel was effective or not, but that was a decision on Bloomberg's part to say that you really need to go outside of the school community to find leadership, because top management didn't support those people who are professionals in the schools, didn't trust them to really do it. And the same thing by extension is happening with the courts. Paul's been involved in that for a long time, but in effect what that is that the court leadership has said the schools needed external intervention, that somebody outside had to really overrule what the insiders were doing in order to ratchet up the system. So one of the problems is we're losing the confidence of the people at the top who really make the decisions about leadership in different ways. Another problem is that we're not really getting feedback in terms of quality improvement from our customers. Now, who are the customers? Well, to some large extent, it's the parents and the children. Well, we often ask the parents in a very perfunctory way, but I suspect that people in the schools don't really want to listen to the parents all that much. You might have to ask them, but we're not, or you're not saying, well, we value that input. And nobody's asking the children. I think it's very rare that a district is really asking the students at any level to really tell them what would work. What's not working, what would work. There's almost nothing being done along those lines. Another problem is the lack of strategic planning. Really applied strategic planning that's followed. And there are models out there for strategic planning processes, and in particular there are models for community-based strategic planning, which I think is an important element of that. But very often we're just talking, or we're managing these districts at random. Somebody comes up with an idea here, somebody encounters an idea there. This morning there's probably suggestions about, if not dozens, scores, maybe 100 different interventions that are necessary in the school system, and some pop up and take precedence for a while, and then they go on to something else. So we really need a strategic plan we can follow. A second area is human resources, or human capital management. And we talk about the best and brightest, but what do we really do long term to keep those people in the schools? It's not just somebody teaching for a few years as an experience or a lark or whatever, but it's who's going to be there for 10 and 20 or 25 or 30 years, really pounding away and improving what's happening and building those relationships. And not only in the classroom, but who's going to be in, let's say, the back office, so-called. We don't pay enough attention to the human capital and all the support services that are necessary to run a district, which is a very complicated undertaking. There's a lot of emphasis on the teachers, but not enough in terms of all those people who are making the system work. That's very important. Then in terms of compensation, there are discussions about bonus plans and how you reward teachers on an individual basis or a team basis, which is what I would prefer, but probably not enough in terms of what you do in terms of intrinsic rewards versus the extrinsic or monetary rewards. And frankly, we can't afford very much in terms of the monetary rewards. We've got to think of a broader reward structure, and there are all kinds of non-monetary rewards that are evident throughout the public sector. Then third, there's adapting technologies. And I would argue that technology may be the biggest payoff, that the way our society is moving, technology is something that our kids are engaged with from a very early age, but it's not usually focused on education. So how can you harness that to education? How can you get those kids fascinated by it, but also beyond the classroom, how can you make all the data we have transparent and clear to the stakeholders, particularly the parents and the people in the community who need to support the schools. Transparency is very important, and one way we can do that is to look at e-governance models that are out there in the municipalities that do a pretty good job sometimes of clarifying what it is the municipalities do. And I think they're ahead of the school districts if you look at dashboards or various balanced scorecards or whatever. So the e-governance models or e-government models are very important. And there's one particular model out there I don't think the schools are using, which is the CityStat or CompStat model. Now, you may have read about that. It started with the police department in New York. Basically says, take the data you have, put it up in screens around a room, convene your decision makers, your top managers, and have them start discussing why the trends are going in the right direction or the wrong direction and what they can do to improve that, or drive down the crime rate, which they did in New York. And you can do the same thing by extension in public education and say, well, we've got a tremendous amount of data, but we don't look at it in terms of how we make decisions in a coherent way. So, would anybody have the resources, maybe the nerve to do this, to set up a room that way? It's got a lot of LCD screens, but, get your principals there, get other people there who are involved in the whole process, and start picking apart the data and say, how can we get it to go in the right direction? What is the most important interventions we need to make at this point in time? And then come back next week and do it all over again. And what's the next most important intervention, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there are a lot of those models in the public sector that could apply to education easily. Then there's building partnerships or stretching our resources, and this is shared services or regionalization, which I think has a high payoff. But where do you find the partners? Well, I think there's plenty of partners out there who would be eager to work with the public schools and aren't always tapped. I'd start with the municipalities. I think there are a lot of services that could be shared. I would look at the not-for-profits, the community organizations, the universities. Paul's involved in research collaborative that Rutgers is trying to start with the Newark public schools, for example, and I think that's a model that could be used across the state. Private businesses might be forthcoming with resources, philanthropies, private individuals. I think there's all kinds of partners out there, and we don't necessarily go after them, systematically, or create educational foundations or, whatever. And then Fifth is measuring for performance, which I think is one of the most important things you can do. And that's where the data comes in terms of accountability. And that is, if you make the data clear, and some of it's embarrassing, but that's fine. If it's embarrassing, it should come to the surface, and then you have to figure out how to turn things around. And that's where you measure what's going on, not just in terms of the services you're delivering, not just in terms of the outcomes, not just in terms of the tests that are mandated, but also your internal capacities, and maybe track what happens to your graduates down the road. So you know whether you really prepared them to contribute to society, to survive in society, to make a living, to hold a job, to have a family that functions, whatever it is. I don't know if any districts are really doing that and saying 5, 10, 15 years out, what is it that we did, and how do they feel about what the schools did to contribute to that? Now, let me leave you with 4 thoughts as to what I think it is you can do in terms of improving, accountability, which means improving performance. First is to search more broadly for models that can apply. That doesn't mean going to the conference in Hawaii. That always comes up. I think going to conferences is a good idea. You all came to conferences, today, but I think you can, encourage people throughout your system to subscribe to publications or to services that bring new ideas to the surface. I think that's a fairly cheap thing to do. You can encourage them to join networks. There are all kinds of networks out there, and a lot of them are free. But they need to be, able to do that. You might make it a requirement of their annual evaluation that they not only subscribe to the network, but they show evidence that they've participated in a network online. I mean, we run a free network, for example, the Public Performance Measurement and Reporting Network at Rutgers, ppmrn.net, free. We have thousands of resources there, all kinds of ideas that could flow over to the public schools, but there are lots of other networks. The second is when you're looking for models and if you're looking for help and you're spending money, don't automatically think that you have to go to the private sector, that business is the model for the public sector or for efficiency. And for that, I blame Woodrow Wilson. Wilson wrote an essay in 1887 on the science of public administration, basically, that said that we should look to the business model. It was taken as a starting point for that, and he was summarizing what was going on with the good government model at the time. But there are a lot of other models to look at. I wouldn't default to the private sector and say, you need to find a private sector consulting company out there to do your strategic plan, for example. There are ways you can do it yourself, or there are ways you can borrow the expertise from some of those partners that I mentioned before. So I think there are lots of alternatives to this simple-minded notion that a lot of the public has, that we all need to adopt the business model. So, third, I think that we need to consider a competitive model for outsourcing services. If you take some of the districts that we mentioned earlier that aren't performing that well, and you pick them apart, well, which parts of the district which parts aren't performing, which parts of the system aren't working, then you might say, well, can we outsource that? Now, you've got hundreds of potential places to outsource it to, in particular, neighboring districts. Some districts do a very good job, and many districts do a very good job in certain ways, and why can't they contract to provide those services somewhere else in the state, whether it's contiguous or not? I think that that would open up a lot of possibilities for creative solutions and at a much lesser cost than, than other alternatives. And then fourth, I think if we use the data properly for accountability, and we make a good argument as to what we're doing, people will come to realize that the schools add a lot of value, that the schools are really using the money very responsibly, and they are accomplishing things in terms of not just educating kids, but changing their lives, turning kids around in ways that were referred to before, that are compelling arguments. And that associated with case studies, which makes it more tangible, really would allow us to argue from a data-driven basis or a strategic basis that education is really the first priority for public expenditures, that education drives everything else, that if you focus on education, educational outcomes as the primary responsibility across the public sector, and I'm frankly talking municipal and schools, that's our best investment. So, perhaps if we do it right, we could then argue, education is the first priority, or maybe education is the only priority, and everything else follows. Thank you.
Good afternoon. This is the varsity. I see we're losing a few varsity members, but you're the varsity. You hung in here till the best part of the program, actually, so congratulations. All right? I don't do PowerPoints.
No,
I
you
don't,
don't.
just notes on my pad.
Okay, we'll go up here. There we go.
Thank you. Sorry. Okay, I'm not sure where I should start. I have prepared comments, but I took more notes on this page than I had the prepared comments. And the luxury, I guess the advantage of being the last panel member on the last panel is I get to tell you what I think about all the other speakers here today. So I'm not going to do that, but I do have to make a couple of comments. I want to give you a disclaimer, first of all. Sometimes you're late night, usually you're watching TV, and somebody will say, listen, this is going to be a particularly offensive piece that we're about to do, so if you'd like to turn your TV off or turn the volume down or go have a drink in the kitchen, this would be the time to do it. So I am giving you that warning and opportunity right up front. If you have seat belts on there on those chairs, I would pull it over one more notch. I intend to challenge our sensitivities a little bit about some of the issues and some of the topics that we're talking about. Let me tell you this, first of all, about going outside of the schools, but you kind of clean that up at the end about not using the business world as a model. But, I don't know, where should we go? To the automobile industry, to the banks, to the financial institutions, to the real estate world, to the retail market? I'm not sure which model we would want to single out and superimpose it on our educational system. So I'd go slow there myself, all right? I want to also tell you, these are my not prepared comments, but I'll be much, much better. There's a little joke at my office. I'm the executive director, and there's a thing called, I say it a lot, that was then and this is now. And the way that came about is I used to be a cowboy out there. I used to be a field rep. I used to negotiate those contracts that some of you may have concerns about, the amount of the settlements, et cetera. So I spent 20 years out in the field doing that kind of work, okay? And when you're out there in the field, I did a lot of things that I don't allow right now of our staff to do. So when they come to me and they say, well, Vince, but you did that, and you spent that much money on a meal, or you did this after the fact without getting approval, because I did have a mentality of more blessed to get forgiveness than permission, I say to them, that was then and this is now. The reason I'm telling you the story is, I looked at the list of speakers here today, and I'm in education, if you count my first year teaching, 45 years, and I think I'm the rookie on this panel here that we have today. All right? So in this instance, that was then and this is then. It seems to me the way the program is unraveling here. All right? A couple of other quickies I do want to mention. There are a lot of questions, but I don't hear many answers, and that's about the same as it's been in my 45 years in the field of education. We have no shortage of questions. We have a bit of a drought when it comes to answers, and I was particularly pleased, I really was, to hear the candor of the members of the Department of Ed, past and present, actually the confessions that they gave this morning about what they don't know about education or how to do certain things to fix the different problems with education. That was refreshing. I want to say that to you sincerely. All right? Not usually. I guess you're all out of the department now, is that right? And thirdly, I am going to poke some fun. I'll irritate some people here. Pay close attention, because there'll be a Q&A, and you'll get a chance to poke me back, and that's fine, because have some fun with this quick presentation. After this, you got to go out in the traffic on Nassau Street, so this is going to be the highlight of your day. Let me begin by stating that the clamoring and the outcries for greater accountability for our public schools and the men and women who work in them every day, in my opinion, are fed by an erroneous premise that our public education system and our public schools are poor performing or underperforming or flat-out failures. A broken matrix, if you will, of interrelated, inefficient, and unproductive structures and institutions incapable, apparently, incapable of providing first-class 21st century education to our students who attend our public schools. Let me say this, that is simply not true. New Jersey happens to have, overall, one of the best educational systems in this nation, and in some instances, in many instances, I think you'll find world-class education going on in the schools in this state. So I want to make a specific point of that, and you should clap for that. It's a good point. All right? Sure, by the way, I want to be serious. There are some glaring examples, unfortunately, of individual teachers, isolated schools, and even whole school systems, I heard some of that earlier this morning, that are not performing to a standard that any of us would identify as acceptable. But for every instance of underachievement or flat-out failure, there are hundreds and thousands, actually, of examples of teachers, schools, and entire school systems that are providing students with a superior, high-quality education, a thorough, and if I may, efficient and effective educational system. Before we are too quick to condemn the teachers in these schools, the other school personnel, the school systems themselves as underachieving or failing, we have an obligation to examine the reasons and the causes that some of these excel and others do not. Someone made an excellent point this morning, I'm sorry I can't recall, but if you have the comparison of Union City and Asbury Park, I would think if I worked in the Department of Ed, I'd be up there every day in each of those districts finding out what's going on, what is making one click along at the pace it's going, at the superior educational process that it is utilizing, and why the other one just doesn't seem to be able to get it. I think that would be something I would really want to focus on, all right? Today's topic, of course, is supposed to examine the whole issue of accountability within the school setting. Contrary to what some may suspect, some in this room for that matter may, and others will openly state, teachers and other school employees who work very hard in our public schools in this state every day are not afraid to be held accountable. That is, suspense, as long as everyone and everything else that impacts the education of our children are also willing to accept their share of accountability for the education of our children. Let me suggest something to you that I think has been said in any number of different ways by almost every other speaker. Rather than calling for greater accountability, shouldn't we really be asking for all of the stakeholders in the educational process shouldn't we be asking everyone to embrace a spirit of accepting shared responsibility? Shared responsibility, not accountability. How about a system in which all of the stakeholders understand that, and someone mentioned this earlier, our keynote speaker, just as it takes an entire village to raise a child, it takes an entire community to educate a child. Who are the other stakeholders that we might be referring to? How about the parents, the community as a whole, the taxpayers, the school administrators, the politicians, the Department of Ed, the Commissioner of Ed, the State Board of Education, sure, the students, and the teachers, and yes, the teacher unions, all have a responsibility to share in the education of the children that we send to our public schools. I submit that unless all of these entities work cooperatively, work together, embrace the idea that they all share a mutual obligation to provide the highest quality of education to our students in this state, unless that happens, we will not arrive at a formula, no matter how many formula and funding formulas and all the alphabet soup that come out of the Department of Ed in the state of New Jersey, we will not arrive at the appropriate formula to fully improve the public education system in this state. We also need to look at some other things, I think. What about facilities? What about materials? What about supplies? Technology? Do you think in 2009 we ought to have a computer in front of every kid in a public school? I think so. What about professional development opportunities? Some people said earlier, I think a couple of the people who spoke said something about, well, we don't really even give the teachers the right tools, or we don't really tell them what we're really expecting, something to that effect. The way to do that is through a very, very aggressive professional development program. What about some common planning time, where the professionals, the teachers in the schools, with their school administrators and, frankly, with parents, should get together and plan some of the activities in a joint and a cooperative way. Opportunities for meaningful teacher input on educational issues. I could show you a list about 2 blocks long, because we have a bargaining law in the state, and there's an agency called PERC, the Public Employment Relations Commission, and that list that's 2 blocks long are issues that employers, school boards took the position, that's not negotiable. We're not going to talk to you about that. We're not going to negotiate that. All of the quote-unquote educational issues. Well, if you lock the people out of the process in that way, who are the frontline connection with your kids, you sort of get what you get if you are unhappy with what the results happen to be. You have to open that up. You have to let the teaching staff, with parents, with principals, etc., really roll up their sleeves and get involved with the educational process. Let us, teachers, other school employees, let us help develop those educational policies. We should be way past the point of standing on ceremony about whether this is a negotiable or non-negotiable issue. All we're doing there is adults, pissing one another off, excuse my French, and basically forgetting about what our purpose is in terms of educating the kids. Before I go on, I must digress at least 1 minute and make a few comments about some pretty important and some pretty interesting information. New Jersey schools. Let's talk about that under the heading of accountability, etc. Reading and math scores are among the highest in the nation in this state. New Jersey schools score highest, number 1 in the nation, on how well they prepare students for college and for the workforce. High school graduation rates are the highest in the nation in the state of New Jersey, all right? New Jersey schools are first when it comes to graduating students of color in one of the most diverse states, ethnically diverse states in the nation. We have the highest percent of African American and Latino students graduating from high school every year. And we rank number 1 in the nation for reducing the achievement gap between black elementary students and white elementary students in the areas of reading and math, the areas that most people focus on as the core issues we have to get a handle on if we're going to really have our kids enjoy a 21st century education. I'll tell you a little secret, and I'll make my confession at this point, all right? And I'll say 2 active contritions or something on the way home. When I presented this information that I just cited to you at another conference I spoke at earlier this year, a Governor's Economic Conference, excuse me, in Atlantic City, sorry. My mother said you talk too much, Vincent. She was right. When I made these comments about the quality and the place that New Jersey stands in rankings, etc., someone in the audience raised their hands and asked, but what about when measured against private schools, and what about schools in other countries? Here comes my confession. I did not have a good answer for that question that day. But having been a teacher in my earlier formative life, I knew the value of doing some homework. So in case any of you were going to ask me that question, let me offer you the answer. In 2007, Columbia University's study was done that found that low-income urban students in public schools performed as well as low-income private school students of similar socioeconomic backgrounds. Virtually no difference, all right? The key factor, by the way, that they focused on in terms of the key factor, most important ingredient to the education of a kid in a public school or private school, let's have a quiz. I used to be a teacher, let's have a pop quiz, all right? Could it be the money that was spent, the teacher, pupil contact, the curriculum, the principal? What do you think? Most important factor?
I think it's the teacher.
Teacher. Parent involvement. They absolutely determined that the key ingredient that improved the education was the involvement of parents in the educational process. There's a study on it. If you want it, contact me, I'll get it for you, all right? A recent study of New Jersey public and private school students showed that public school students actually outperform private school students on advanced placement exams, and that the public school students are more likely to receive AP grades that qualify for college credit. Let's talk about the international thing. That always comes up. I'm always confronted with that and say, well, you know, what about the Japanese, and what about the Chinese, and what about whichever other group is in vogue at the moment, all right? International comparisons. When the test scores of United States students are compared with other nations by the percentage of their school students who live in poverty, the United States either ranks first in international reading literacy and science in grade 4, and third in grade 4 math. That's the kind of comparison you have to make. You can't make the comparison in these other countries where they are so selective, right? They're not letting most of the kids go to the same public schools. They're so selective, and you want to make the comparison of those kids that they hand-pick and select against our broad spectrum of kids. Everybody gets to go to a public school in this country, certainly in this state. That's not a fair comparison. Let's do apples and apples, right? And thirdly, the United States, unfortunately, does rank number 1 in a couple of other areas that we should not be very proud of. One of the largest income and wealth gaps between the poor and the rich among industrialized nations here in the United States, right? And growing every day. Have you seen some of these statistics on TV recently because of the economic situation, the growth of CEO and executive salaries compared to the working people's salaries? It used to be about 45 to 1. It's about 450 to 1 now. That's a trend that we need to take a good look at. And President Obama is, as I understand it. Okay, I'm going to quote you something. I don't want to read to you, but I'm going to quote you something from Education Week, which I just find to be very interesting. In Education Week on June 4th, 2008, that edition, etc., it's called Myths That Continue to Confound Us, and it is an article by Iris Rotberg. She's a research professor at George Washington University. She says, our policy deliberations, because we talked a lot about policy here today, our policy deliberations are dominated by the belief that we can cure our educational problems if only we could find a magic bullet. scientifically proven teaching methods, school choice, increased student testing, etc. If we only could succeed, our students would rank higher on international test comparisons, which in turn will enable the United States to compete in the global economy. That's another catchphrase right now, right? These beliefs are based on a set of loosely coupled myths about U.S. education. The myths form the basis of much of our rhetoric and, unfortunately, much of the formation of our policies, all right? This is not me. This is the researcher who did this, all right? The first myth is that we can actually fix our schools without addressing the problems of our society, and particularly the problems of poverty. We can't, she concludes. And the second myth, she says, a second myth holds that the international test score comparisons are valid measures of quality education, and I just indicated why I didn't think so. The fact is that test score comparisons tell us little about the quality of education in any country. And that article goes on. I won't take time here right now to deal with that any further, all right, because I know I'm going to get the hook here pretty soon. One of our research staff at NJEA, Bob Willoughby, happens to be up in the audience, has an interesting view of the need for greater teacher accountability. He says it already exists, and in spades. He creates a model which is concentric circles, and at the heart of the concentric circle pattern is the student learning process. And as you go out around it, I'm sorry I didn't do a visual for this, you have how are teachers really evaluated? How accountable are they? Well, here's a little sample of some of the accountability. There's report cards, there's parent-teacher conferences, there's online grading, there's online conferences, there's teacher evaluation procedures formal, there's teacher evaluation procedures informal by school administrators, there's school board oversight, school boards offer contracts or not. You know, they can determine not to rehire somebody. A non-tenured teacher, easy. A tenured teacher, not that hard. If they do their homework, you can certainly do it. I know that's a whole different topic for another day, but I'm a little tired of that tenure issue also. There are specific ways to deal with the issue of tenure if a school district and administration wants to do their job as they should. Student results in the outside world, I just gave you some of those comparisons. We have a commissioner of education. It is a state system, so she has oversight. We have a legislature. We have one of the key legislators here this morning, who's the head of the Assembly Education Committee. And extra added bonus, we have 101.5. We have the Star Ledger, you know, so we probably, in education, I think, we probably have the most studied, the most oversight, the most accountability of any profession I'm aware of, more than doctors. Doctors, of course, you know the difference, of course, right? They get to bury the mistakes. We need to continue to work with our mistakes. So there is a difference, okay? Finally, a few random thoughts and comments on the pay for performance and merit pay issue. You have a whole variety pack of systems, so a rose by any other name if you want to substitute pay for performance, merit pay, ladder, what is that called, the ladder thing? Career ladder, etc. All kinds of different differentiated staffing, differentiated compensation. All right. So just so I'm clear with you, this is the part I'll do the poking. NJEA is opposed to any form of merit pay or performance pay because they don't work. They've never worked. I don't know of one system that has actually been created that has had a life expectancy of more than a couple of years. They pop up, somebody convinces someone to try it, and they go away. The reason they go away is they don't work. They create problems. There's total disharmony among the staff that are involved. Administrators don't even like to get involved with the process. If it's a voluntary process, by the way, in our state, it can be negotiated. If an employer wants a merit pay system, they bring it to the bargaining table, they negotiate. If there's an agreement, they'll have a merit pay system. If there's not an agreement, they won't have a merit pay system. I don't know that 5 boards bring the issue to the bargaining table even. So I don't know what that's about. If that's such an important ingredient or something that we really need to have, nobody's even addressing the issue from the other side. I don't have time for the Letterman top 10, so I'm cutting it to the top 5. Reasons why I don't think this whole issue of performance pay or merit pay is worth anything, right? It doesn't survive, it doesn't last, it just doesn't work. You can point to examples, by the way, and we don't have time today to look at each of them, but New York City is in one system right now where they do it on a whole school basis, and it's a totally voluntary system, all right? Washington, D.C., if a teacher wants to give up their job protection, their security, their tenure, at the door, they can go in and they can get additional compensation for that, all right? Denver, Colorado had a system. I think it's defunct now. Portland, Maine has a system. I think it's on its way to a happy hunting ground. Philadelphia also had some sort of a system I'm not as familiar with. So don't worry about writing them all down, because if anybody ever invites me back next year, I'll have a different list, because these won't be on it. They don't last because they don't work. Now, I'd like to close by saying that NJEA, and I want to be very, very serious about this, has been and is willing to continue to have an open, legitimate mind to educational reform. If there's educational reform that is in the interest of students and the interest of improving the educational system in this state, we're first in line. We're the first one with our hand up, okay? We work very closely with the Department of Education, with Lucille Davey, the Commissioner of Education, with the Governor of this state on many of his initiatives. The 21st Century School was a governor's initiative, etc. We support that. We support most of the revamping of the quote-unquote accountability regs that the department is currently in the process of putting forward. If it's pro-kid, pro-education, pro-schools, we're going to be there, we're going to be for it. Having said that, we are also going to remain vigilant and steadfast if somebody continues to try to peddle change for the sake of change. I think one of the biggest problems, and I'll end on this, one of the biggest problems we have had in this state, in the whole area of education, and I think I heard some of this from my colleagues from the Department of Ed, all right, is that we bring in a new program, a new structure, we don't have the resources, we don't have the capacity, we run it a while, and then there's a new governor elected and a new commissioner appointed, so we throw that system out, we bring a new system in. That constant disruption and change does not work well in educating kids out there. Nobody knows what page you're supposed to be on. And that's still at play right now, even though I highly respect the current administration and the current commissioner. There's another whole wave of changes coming in, and you can't run it. You have to leave something in place. You have to let it settle in a little bit. You have to evaluate it, and then you have to tweak it and improve it. You don't have to toss it out every time some new administration or new group of bureaucrats get into the process. Did I poke anybody here? All right. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank our speakers and all of you for staying to the end. Now, if there are any questions, this is the time to ask them. Anyone? Okay. I guess the gentleman in the blue and then the lady right behind you.
No Child Left Behind mandates some objective testing, and if I understand correctly, the need for objective testing was justified when we found that self-reporting of performance, grades, graduation rates, was greatly inaccurate in a great number of schools, especially those schools that were failing. So it was felt that there was a need for objective testing that would be resistant to tampering by the people who were being evaluated. Now, Dr. Corcoran earlier did mention that a lot of these objective tests have very limited validity. So my question is this. Do we have on the shelf right now better evaluation methods that would be objective and resistant to tampering by the people who are being evaluated? If not, when will we have them? When can they be implemented? Should we continue using the objective tests that we currently have, or should we abandon them? Thank you.
I think that's for you, Mark.
Is that for me? Okay. I think the point that Mr. Corcoran was trying to make, and one that's quite evident is that if you have a very short time period to assess a student, then you can only assess sort of a subset of the standards. Let's say in fourth grade mathematics, if there's a whole set of knowledge you want that student to have, and you have half an hour to assess her, you're limited to that. There's a real tension with assessment under No Child Left Behind. There had been assessments in place in other states prior to No Child Left Behind, like Kentucky, that had different open-ended questions, for example, ways of assessing classes of students so they could get deeper and more broadly across the standards. What No Child Left Behind brought about was a requirement to teach every child, test every child, every grade, every year, grades 3 to 8, and get those test scores out quickly. So that took what had been a lot of innovation in assessment and basically took us back to where we were 20, 25 years ago, back to multiple choice tests that could be scored quickly, cheaply. So yes, there are ways to test children on more skills and to assess the depth of those skills, but it really doesn't comport with the current accountability system that's being required by the federal government.
Are those methods of testing, are they resistant to influence by the people being evaluated, and are they timely, and are they affordable?
You've got three conflicting goals. Sort of picking up on what David Hesby said about formulas, if you have multiple goals. So yes, there are ways to assess children that would not be susceptible to, let's say, to the teachers, if that's what you're concerned about. But it takes time, and if you can do it for every individual student, and it's costly. Use the advanced placement exam as an example, where you have multiple choice, you have written essays and so on. Those are assessed by external evaluators. They're expensive, and it takes a lot, and they're lengthy exams. So multiply that times 1.4 million children, you get a sense of what it would cost us. Is that okay?
Well, what's your suggestion?
Let's have a side conversation about that, because I think it's another question behind you.
Another question concerning testing. This would be in the area for improving performance of students, not so much in the area of preventing students from, fudging the results. People's brains differ. They function differently. People have different learning styles and different learning capabilities, and therefore my question is, to what extent have tests been developed, or have any tests been developed that would basically evaluate an individual's learning style so that teaching that individual could be oriented to align with his learning style?
Can I try that? I'm not sure there's any one test that is going to meet that requirement. That's why I think it is wise to look at multiple tests, portfolios, direct assessment. I don't think you're going to find one test that's going to be this silver bullet test that I think both questions there might be addressing. I think you have to have a wide range of opportunities to assess a student and the progress that student is making, and that's going to involve a variety of different applications, in my opinion.
Could I just underscore that point? That I think you need multiple data points about any student, about any class, about any school, just as you do with any service in the public sector. And the more you have multiple points, the less opportunity there is to manipulate the data, because you're getting more of a multidimensional picture.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, we've just launched a study looking at the post-secondary results of students who graduate with the so-called SRA, Supplemental Review Assessment, and a standard HESPA state test diploma, because I think in theory the SRA is a portfolio test. It tries to do things that a paper and pencil multiple choice test doesn't do. The popular wisdom is it's a sham and it's just an easy way to get kids out of high school and to keep the graduation rate higher than it would otherwise be. I don't think we know. I mean, the premise of our study is, who knows? Let's find out what actually happens to people who graduate through these two different means. And if there is no difference, that seems to suggest the SRA is not indeed a sham at all. If there is a differential result, let's see which side it favors and go from there. But, I mean, I mentioned initially, and others have underscored the importance of having a serious research and development capability at the district level, probably more efficiently at the state level, to look at these kinds of things and make policy based on fact, not on surmise and belief and sometimes, frankly, prejudice.
Can I do a footnote on that?
Sure.
Assemblyman Cryan made a very strong point about his view of the SRA, right? This morning he's very strongly opposed. I happen to know that from many conversations with him about it. But the hard question to answer is, what in the alternative? That's already an alternative, right? We do know that different kids learn differently, have different capacities for learning, etc. If you don't have some system which gives some of these kids that opportunity, what happens to them? Do we not graduate them? Do we not have? They don't have a high school degree, so they leave and they go out into the marketplace right now in this economy in particular, with not even a high school degree, etc. And unfortunately, many times the next thing that happens is they're in a situation where they wind up in another institution we have in this state, not a school, but a prison. Okay, and the cost for that is about threefold times what it would take to educate a kid. So there's got to be some way to allow these kids to find a way to get the data. We don't want to water down the education that they are receiving, etc. I would invite everybody to take a very close look, put it under a microscope at the SRA. It is a very challenging process. It is a highly regarded one by most experts, and I'm very glad the Department of Education is not throwing that aside, because they'd have some serious problems about what they do with all these kids who have no place else to go but out on the street.
Anybody else? Last question.
Just wanted to say that last point, talk about increasing standards and increasing rigor. I think at some point we're kind of kidding ourselves that all our children are going to have, within a given population, that's just not mathematically possible. And I think I've been to a lot of conferences and touched meetings like this, and I've heard, maybe on the literacy side, I've heard adults say, I'm not a math person. Maybe people in this room would feel that way. And I just have to think, well, you're lucky. You're lucky you went to school when that was then, not now. Because if we don't have these other alternatives to look, we're shutting kids out. And we're saying that there's a certain way to be accepted, to be competent. And there's another way that we're going to label it. And in kindergarten, you're going to feel the stigma of you are different and you are behind. And I think we really need to look at that as part of this accountability.
Mike, I actually get the last word, not Trachtenberg or any of these other people.
I get the last
You
word.
can have it. I know you can. But when that whole conversation was going on about the Abbotts, et cetera, I was surprised at you that you did not say. The Abbott experiment, I'll call it, has been extremely successful. The scores, the achievement gains, et cetera, in our urban districts under the Abbott program has been phenomenal. Have there been the Asbury Parks that were mentioned? Unfortunately, yes. I don't know what's in the water down there. Somebody should be looking at that. But on the whole, the Abbott process has been an extremely productive and successful educational one for the kids in those schools.
in the context of today and closing, and Rich will have a chance to actually have the last word. There's a couple observations very quickly. As I said this morning, the genesis of today's forum was a conversation I had with Paul about the efficient side, and as I learned today, really about the effectiveness side. And I think that we're at a point now in the context of education in terms of the state and the federal resources and local resources where there isn't a whole lot more money right now to put into education. And to the extent that the people in this room who are deeply involved in the educational system want to even maintain the money that they have, this idea of coming up with a way to determine how effective we're being and prove that to combat what is a lot of subjectivity, I think, and a lot of perceptions. The whole NCLB model is based on a perception that's drawn out of how many schools are failing as opposed to how many schools are doing well. The whole focus is on sanctions as opposed to performance incentives. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to think long and hard about what we can do individually and collectively to prove out and use some of the methods that we talked about today to figure out a way to justify, because I think increasingly that's what we're going to have to do, the levels of spending that exceed just about everything else that's spent in the public sector moving forward. And I hope that today is probably the first part of an ongoing discussion on this subject. And I'd welcome a lot of the people to come back and see where we are next year when this isn't then, this is next year. Rich?
Just a quick thank you for coming. We appreciate your participation. I'd particularly like to thank the panel here and those stalwart panel members who hung in, Ernie Rioch and Paul Trachtenberg and Tom Corcoran and Jerry Vanatica, and I think that's it. And I appreciate particularly, Paul, your opening comments and presentation was terrific, PowerPoint and everything. In addition, I know this is a clientele that's mostly education-oriented, but at the Institute here, we run a lot of public policy forums on different topics. For example, next month we're running one on transportation and infrastructure financing. Opening speaker is the chairman of the board of the Port Authority. And the following month we're running one on emergency preparedness and what needs to be done in the region in case there is an emergency of whatever source. The opening speaker to that is Governor Kane. So check our website, any other forum you want to come on to, but this is always one of our most favorite ones. This is our second one within a year, specifically on education, financing, and productivity and improvement, because it is, where we spend most of our money and where the outcomes of which are most critical, that is the performance of our children. So thanks for coming, and we'll see you next time.